Section 12 of Commentary on the Epistle of Paul the Apostle to the Ephesians by John Calvin, translated by William Pringle. This Librivox recording is in the public domain. Ephesians chapter 6, verses 1 to 9. Children, obey your parents in the Lord, for this is right. Honour thy father and mother, which is the first commandment with promise, that it may be well with thee, and thou mayest live long on the earth. And, ye fathers, provoke not your children to wrath, but bring them up in the nurture and admonition of the Lord. Children, obey. Why does the apostle use the word obey instead of honour, which has a greater extent of meaning? It is because obedience is the evidence of that honour which children owe to their parents, and is therefore more earnestly enforced. It is likewise more difficult, for the human mind recoils from the idea of subjection, and with difficulty allows itself to be placed under the control of another. Experience shows how rare this virtue is, for do we find one among 1,000 that is obedient to his parents? By a figure of speech, a part is here put for the whole, but it is the most important part, and is necessarily accompanied by all the others. In the Lord. Besides the law of nature, which is acknowledged by all nations, the obedience of children is enforced by the authority of God. Hence it follows that parents are to be obeyed, so far only as is consistent with piety to God, which comes first in order. If the command of God is the rule by which the submission of children is to be regulated, it would be foolish to suppose that the performance of this duty could lead away from God himself. For this is right. This is added in order to restrain the fierceness which, we have already said, appears to be natural to almost all men. He proves it to be right because God has commanded it, for we are not at liberty to dispute or call in question the appointment of him whose will is the unerring rule of goodness and righteousness. That honour should be represented as including obedience is not surprising, for mere ceremony is of no value in the sight of God. The precept, honour thy father and mother, comprehends all the duties by which the sincere affection and respect of children to their parents can be expressed, which is the first commandment with promise. The promises annexed to the commandments are intended to excite our hopes and to impart a greater cheerfulness to our obedience. And therefore Paul uses this as a kind of seasoning to render the submission which he enjoins on children more pleasant and agreeable. He does not merely say that God has offered a reward to him who obeys his father and mother, but that such an offer is peculiar to this commandment. If each of the commandments had its own promises, there would have been no ground for the commendation bestowed in the present instance. But this is the first commandment, Paul tells us, which God has been pleased, as it were, to seal by a remarkable promise. There is some difficulty here, for the second commandment likewise contains a promise. I am the Lord thy God, who show mercy unto thousands of them that love me and keep my commandments. But this is universal, applying indiscriminately to the whole law, and cannot be said to be annexed to that commandment. Paul's assertion still holds true that no other commandment, but that which enjoins the obedience due by children to their parents, is distinguished by a promise. That it may be well with thee. The promise is a long life, from which we are led to understand that the present life is not to be overlooked among the gifts of God. On this and other kindred subjects I must refer my reader to the Institutes of the Christian Religion, satisfying myself at present with saying in a few words that the reward promised to the obedience of children is highly appropriate. Those who show kindness to their parents, from whom they derived life, are assured by God that in this life it will be well with them, and that thou mayest live long on the earth. Moses expressly mentions the land of Canaan, that thy days may be long upon the land which the Lord thy God giveth thee. Beyond this the Jews could not conceive of any life more happy or desirable, but as the same divine blessing is extended to the whole world, Paul has properly left out the mention of a place, the peculiar distinction of which lasted only until the coming of Christ. And ye fathers. Parents, on the other hand, are exhorted not to irritate their children by unreasonable severity. This would excite hatred and would lead them to throw off the yoke altogether. Accordingly, in writing to the Colossians, he adds, lest they be discouraged. Kind and liberal treatment has rather a tendency to cherish reverence for their parents, and to increase the cheerfulness and activity of their obedience, while a harsh and unkind manner rouses them to obstinacy and destroys the natural affections. But Paul goes on to say, let them be fondly cherished, for the Greek word which is translated bring up unquestionably conveys the idea of gentleness and forbearance. To guard them, however, against the opposite and frequent evil of excessive indulgence, he again draws the rein which he had slackened and adds, in the instruction and reproof of the Lord. It is not the will of God that parents, in the exercise of kindness, shall spare and corrupt their children. Let their conduct toward their children be at once mild and considerate, so as to guide them in the fear of the Lord, and correct them also when they go astray. That age is so apt to become wanton that it requires frequent admonition and restraint. Servants, be obedient to them that are your masters according to the flesh, with fear and trembling, in singleness of your heart, as unto Christ. Not with eye service as men pleasers, but as the servants of Christ, doing the will of God from the heart, with good will, doing service as to the Lord and not to men, knowing that whatsoever good thing any man doeth, the same shall he receive of the Lord, whether he be bond or free. And ye masters, do the same things unto them, forbearing threatening, knowing that your master also is in heaven, neither is there respect of persons with him. Servants, be obedient. His exhortation to servants is so much the more earnest on account of the hardship and bitterness of their condition, which renders it more difficult to be endured. And he does not speak merely of outward obedience, but says more about fear willingly rendered. For it is a very rare occurrence to find one who willingly yields himself to the control of another. The servants, whom he immediately addresses, were not hired servants like those of the present day, but slaves, such as were in ancient times, whose slavery was perpetual, unless, through the favour of their masters, they obtained freedom, whom their masters bought with money, that they might impose upon them the most degrading employments, and might, with the full protection of the law, exercise over them the power of life and death. To such, he says, obey your masters, lest they should vainly imagine that carnal freedom has been procured for them by the gospel. But as some of the worst men were compelled by the dread of punishment, he distinguishes between Christian and ungodly servants by the feelings which they cherished. With fear and trembling, that is, with the careful respect which springs from an honest purpose. It can hardly be expected, however, that so much deference will be paid to a mere man, unless a higher authority shall enforce the obligation, and therefore he adds, as doing the will of God. Hence it follows that it is not enough if their obedience satisfy the eyes of men, for God requires truth and sincerity of heart. When they serve their masters faithfully, they obey God. As if he had said, do not suppose that by the judgment of men you are thrown into slavery. It is God who has laid upon you this burden, who has placed you in the power of your masters. He who conscientiously endeavours to render what he owes to his master performs his duty, not to man only, but to God. With good will doing service. This is contrasted with the suppressed indignation which swells the bosom of slaves. Though they dare not openly break out or give signs of obstinacy, their dislike of the authority exercised over them is so strong that it is with the greatest unwillingness and reluctance that they obey their masters. Whoever reads the accounts of the dispositions and conduct of slaves, which are scattered through the writings of the ancients, will be at no loss to perceive that the number of injunctions here given does not exceed that of the diseases which prevailed among this class, and which it was of importance to cure. But the same instruction applies to male and female servants of our own times. It is God who appoints and regulates all the arrangements of society. As the condition of servants is much more agreeable than that of slaves in ancient times, they ought to consider themselves far less excusable if they do not endeavour in every way to comply with Paul's injunctions. Masters according to the flesh. This expression is used to soften the harsh aspect of slavery. He reminds them that their spiritual freedom, which was by far the most desirable, remained untouched. Eye service is mentioned because almost all servants are addicted to flattery, but as soon as their master's back is turned, indulge freely in contempt or perhaps in ridicule. Paul therefore enjoins godly persons to keep at the greatest distance from such deceitful pretences. Knowing that whatsoever good thing any man doeth. What a powerful consolation! However unworthy, however ungrateful or cruel their masters may be, God will accept their services as rendered to himself. When servants take into account the pride and arrogance of their masters, they often become more indolent from the thought that their labor is thrown away. But Paul informs them that their reward is laid up with God for services which appear to be ill bestowed on unfeeling men, and that there is no reason, therefore, why they should be led aside from the path of duty. He adds, whether bond or free. No distinction is made between a slave and a free man. The world is wont to set little value on the labors of slaves, but God esteems them as highly as the duties of kings. In his estimate, the outward station is thrown aside, and each is judged according to the uprightness of his heart. And ye masters. In the treatment of their slaves, the laws granted to masters a vast amount of power. Whatever had thus been sanctioned by the civil code was regarded by many as in itself lawful. To such an extent did their cruelty in some instances proceed that the Roman emperors were forced to restrain their tyranny. But though no royal edicts had ever been issued for the protection of slaves, God allows to masters no power over them beyond what is consistent with the law of love. When philosophers attempt to give to the principles of equity their full extent in restraining the excess of severity to slaves, they inculcate that masters ought to treat them in the same manner as hired servants, but they never look beyond utility, and in judging even of that, they inquire only what is advantageous to the head of the family or conducive to proper order. The apostle proceeds on a very different principle. He lays down what is lawful according to the divine appointment, and how far they too are debtors to their servants. Do the same things to them. Perform the duty which on your part you owe to them. What he calls in another epistle that which is just and equal is precisely what in this passage he calls the same things. And what is this but the law of analogy? Masters and servants are not indeed on the same level, but there is a mutual law which binds them. By this law, servants are placed under the authority of their masters, and by the same law, due regard being had to the difference of their station, masters lie under certain obligations to their servants. This analogy is greatly misunderstood, because men do not try it by the law of love, which is the only true standard. Such is the import of Paul's phrase, the same things. For we are all ready enough to demand what is due to ourselves, but when our own duty comes to be performed, everyone attempts to plead exemption. It is chiefly, however, among persons of authority and rank that injustice of this sort prevails. Forbearing threatenings. Every expression of disdain arising from the pride of masters is included in the single word threatenings. They are charged not to assume a lordly air or a terrific attitude, as if they were constantly threatening some evil against their servants when they have occasion to address them. Threatenings and every kind of barbarity originate in this, that masters look upon their servants as if they had been born for their sake alone, and treat them as if they were of no more value than cattle. Under this one description, Paul forbids every kind of disdainful and barbarous treatment. Their master and yours. A very necessary warning. What is there which we will not dare to attempt against our inferiors, if they have no ability to resist and no means of obtaining redress, if no avenger, no protector appears, none who will be moved by compassion to listen to their complaints? It happens here, in short, according to the common proverb, that impunity is the mother of licentiousness. But Paul here reminds them that, while masters possess authority over their servants, they have themselves the same master in heaven to whom they must render an account. And there is no respect of persons with him. A regard to persons blinds our eyes, so as to leave no room for law or justice, but Paul affirms that it is of no value in the sight of God. By person is meant anything about a man which does not belong to the real question, and which we take into account in forming a judgment. Relationship, beauty, rank, wealth, friendship, and everything of this sort gain our favour, while the opposite qualities produce contempt and sometimes hatred. As those absurd feelings arising from the sight of a person have the greatest possible influence on human judgments, those who are invested with power are apt to flatter themselves, as if God would countenance such corruptions. Who is he that God should regard him or defend his interest against mine? Paul, on the contrary, informs masters that they are mistaken if they suppose that their servants will be of little or no account before God, because they are so before men. God is no respecter of persons, and the cause of the meanest man will not be a whit less regarded by him than that of the loftiest monarch. End of section 12.